At 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning that would reshape American aviation history, RETIRED, Colonel Diana Vasquez received a phone call that began with 5 words she never expected to hear. "The President needs you immediately." Just 18 months. Earlier, Diana had been escorted from Thunderbolt Air Force Base in disgrace. Her 32-year career ended by a pink slip and the crushing words, "Organizational restructuring requires younger leadership." At 61, they said she was too old, too set in her ways, too resistant to modern warfare protocols. The same woman may now desperately needed to prevent an international catastrophe that had already claimed 4 aircraft and 16 lives in the past. 72 hours. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying this story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Diana stood in her small kitchen in Copper Creek, Montana, still holding the secure satellite phone that had shattered her quiet retirement, listening to the urgency in Deputy Defense Secretary Sarah Chun's voice. The irony wasn't lost on her that the same government officials who had deemed her obsolete were now begging her to return because every pilot they'd trained to replace her had failed spectacularly when confronted with a crisis that required more than computer simulations and theoretical knowledge. The call had awakened her from the first peaceful sleep she'd enjoyed in months, dreams uninterrupted by the phantom sounds of aircraft engines and the weight of command decisions that had defined her adult life. Her modest cabin, nestled among towering pines and overlooking a pristine mountain lake, had become her sanctuary after the humiliation of forced retirement. Here she could tend her vegetable garden, restore vintage motorcycles, and pretend that the world of military aviation continued spinning without her expertise. But as Chun outlined the scope of the crisis that had prompted this unprecedented presidential request, Diana felt the familiar knot of anticipation forming in her stomach. Somewhere over the Pacific, a hijacked commercial airliner with 312 passengers was flying an erratic course toward the continental United States. Standard intercept protocols had failed catastrophically. The hijackers had somehow disabled the aircraft's transponder while maintaining control of all other systems, making the Boeing 777 nearly invisible to conventional tracking methods. 4 F-22 Raptors, sent to establish visual contact, had been lost in the past 3 days. Their pilots unable to adapt when their sophisticated tracking systems proved useless against an adversary who understood exactly how to exploit the weaknesses in modern military technology. "Colonel Vasquez," Chun continued, her voice strained with exhaustion and desperation, "we've lost contact with Bravo Squadron entirely. Their last transmission indicated complete navigation failure at approximately 200 miles west of the California coast. Radar shows debris fields, but we can't confirm pilot status or recovery operations in current sea conditions." Diana closed her eyes, visualizing the tactical situation that Chen was describing. She'd encountered similar scenarios during her years commanding the Pacific Theater Air Defense Division, back when military planners still valued experience over technological innovation. The hijackers weren't using advanced equipment to avoid detection. They were exploiting the military's over-reliance on systems that could be compromised or confused by someone who understood their limitations. What about the backup squadrons? From Nellis? Diana asked, her tactical mind automatically analyzing response options despite her civilian status. "Grounded," Chun replied tersely. "The Joint Chiefs don't want to risk additional aircraft until we understand how the hijackers are defeating our intercept capabilities. Every pilot we've sent up there has been trained on the same systems, using the same protocols, following the same tactical manuals. Whatever they're facing out there, our current training isn't preparing them for it." Diana walked to her kitchen window, looking out at the mountain landscape that had provided refuge from the memories of missions where lives depended on split-second decisions made with incomplete information. The sunrise painted the peaks in shades of orange and gold. The same colors she'd watched countless times from aircraft cockpits around the world. She'd flown in conflicts where GPS satellites were unreliable, where electronic warfare made sophisticated navigation systems worthless, where survival depended on the kind of fundamental flying skills that modern military training had gradually abandoned in favor of computer-assisted everything. The President is personally requesting your immediate reinstatement and deployment, Chung continued. Whatever happened during your last evaluation, whatever issues led to your retirement, none of that matters now. We need someone who can find and intercept that aircraft using methods that don't depend on the systems the hijackers are exploiting. The mention of her last evaluation brought back memories Diana had tried to suppress. General Morrison, a career politician in uniform who'd never flown a combat mission, had sat across from her in a sterile conference room and explained that her resistance to modernization made her unsuitable for continued service. Her attempts to maintain training programs in manual navigation and basic flight skills had been dismissed as wasteful nostalgia. Her warnings about overdependence on technology had been characterized as fear-mongering from someone too old to adapt to contemporary warfare. "I've read your complete service record," Chun said, as if sensing Diana's hesitation. "Operation Desert Shield, where you flew 17 successful missions through electronic jamming that disabled every other aircraft's navigation systems. The Kosovo deployment, where you established a new protocol for low-visibility intercepts after conventional methods failed. The classified mission over North Korea in 2018, where you manually piloted a damaged F-16 home after complete instrumentation failure, saving intelligence that prevented an international incident." Diana remembered each of those missions with crystalline clarity. They shared a common thread: situations where technology failed and survival depended on fundamental flying skills that took decades to master. The same skills that military training had gradually de-emphasized as aircraft became more sophisticated and seemingly foolproof. "Colonel, we estimate that hijacked aircraft will reach the continental United States in approximately 14 hours. Current trajectory suggests targets include either Los Angeles or San Francisco, with passenger manifest indicating multiple high-value individuals, including technology executives and government officials. The economic and political implications of a successful attack are catastrophic, but more importantly, we're talking about over 300 innocent lives." Diana set down the phone and walked to her bedroom, where her old flight suit hung in the closet like a museum piece. The worn fabric told the story of a career that had spanned 3 decades and 6 different aircraft types, from the early days when pilots learned to fly by instinct and experience to the modern era, where computers made most decisions and pilots had become systems managers rather than aviators. Beside the flight suit hung her collection of commendations and medals, tangible reminders of missions where her experience had made the difference between success and catastrophe. But the most important item in that closet wasn't official recognition or military decorations. It was a small leather notebook, weathered from years of use, containing handwritten notes about flying techniques that weren't taught in any manual or simulation program. "The aircraft they want you to fly is your old F-16, tail number 847 Alpha," Chun continued when Diana returned to the phone. "It's been maintained in flight-ready condition at Thunderbolt Base, though it's considered obsolete by current standards. The avionics package is 20 years old. The navigation systems are analog backups to digital displays, and the weapons systems require manual targeting rather than computer-assisted lock-on." A smile played at the corners of Diana's mouth. They were offering her an aircraft that the modern military considered a relic, equipped with systems that younger pilots had been trained to view as inferior to their digital alternatives. But Diana knew that sometimes the oldest tools were the most reliable, especially when facing adversaries who understood exactly how to exploit the weaknesses in newer technology. Colonel, I need an answer within the next 30 minutes. The President is convening an emergency session with the Joint Chiefs at 0800 hours, and your participation in this mission requires immediate presidential authorization and reinstatement to active duty. Are you willing to serve? Diana looked around her peaceful cabin, at the life she'd built after being discarded by an institution that had consumed 4 decades of her existence. The garden she'd planted, the books she'd been reading, the simple routines that had slowly healed the wounds of forced retirement. Returning to military service meant abandoning this sanctuary and risking everything in a mission that had already claimed multiple aircraft and crews. The world. Tell the President I'll be airborne within 6 hours. As she ended the call and began gathering the gear she'd never expected to need again, Diana reflected on the bitter irony of the situation. 18 months ago, she'd been dismissed as too old to adapt to modern warfare. Today, she was being recalled because modern warfare had proven inadequate to handle a crisis that required the kind of experience-based judgment that couldn't be programmed into computers or taught in simulators. The hijackers had made one critical miscalculation. They'd planned their operation around defeating the modern military's technological advantages, but they hadn't anticipated facing a pilot who'd learned to fly before those technologies existed. Someone who could fight and win using methods that predated the systems they'd learned to exploit. Diana pulled on her flight suit for the first time in 18 months. The familiar weight of the fabric settling around her shoulders like armor crafted from years of experience and survival. In a few hours, she would be climbing into an aircraft cockpit again, not as a nostalgic gesture or ceremonial flight, but as the sharp end of American military response to a crisis that threatened hundreds of lives and national security. Woman they'd called too old to serve was about to demonstrate that some skills improve with age. That experience earned through surviving impossible situations was worth more than any technological advancement, and that dismissing expertise based on calendar years was a mistake. That could cost lives when the stakes were highest. As she drove toward Thunderbolt Air Force Base through the Montana morning, Diana couldn't help but wonder how many other experienced professionals had been pushed aside in the name of modernization, their knowledge deemed obsolete by people who'd never faced the kind of challenges where survival depended on more than following computer prompts and standard operating procedures. Today would be a test of more than just her flying skills. It would be a validation of every pilot who'd ever been told their experience was less valuable than youth. Every professional who'd been discarded for refusing to abandon proven methods in favor of unproven innovations. The President hadn't called her because she was the youngest or most technologically advanced pilot available. He'd called her because she was the one most likely to bring those passengers home alive. And sometimes that was the only qualification that truly mattered. Diana's return to Thunderbolt Air Force Base felt like stepping through a portal into Ku, a past life she'd been forced to abandon. The security checkpoint guards, most of whom she'd never seen before, studied her retired military identification with the kind of suspicious scrutiny reserved for unwelcome visitors. The irony wasn't lost on her that she needed special authorization to enter a facility where she'd once held command authority over 3,000 personnel and a fleet of aircraft worth billions of dollars. The base had changed dramatically in the 18 months since her forced retirement. New digital display boards announced training schedules and mission parameters in crisp LED displays that replaced the traditional bulletin boards she remembered. Automated security systems scanned identification cards and biometric data, replacing the human guards who had once greeted returning pilots by name. Everything looked more efficient, more streamlined, more technologically advanced. It also looked distinctly less personal, as if the institutional memory of individual relationships and accumulated wisdom had been systematically digitized and sanitized. Colonel Marcus Webb, the base commander who had replaced her, met Diana at the main administration building with an expression that mixed professional courtesy with barely concealed discomfort. Webb was 42 years old, a graduate of the Air Force Academy's most recent modernization programs, and a true believer in the technological superiority that defined contemporary military aviation. He'd been one of the most vocal advocates for Diana's retirement, arguing that her resistance to innovation represented a liability in an era where warfare was increasingly dependent on integrated digital systems and real-time data analysis. Colonel Vasquez, Webb said, extending his hand with the kind of measured politeness that military protocol demanded, "Welcome back to Thunderbolt. I've been briefed on the situation and your reinstatement orders. We'll provide whatever support you need for this mission." Diana shook his hand, noting the calluses that suggested Webb still flew regularly, but also observing the subtle signs of a career spent more in conference rooms than cockpits. His flight suit was immaculate, pressed with military precision, but lacking the worn patches and faded fabric that came from thousands of hours in actual aircraft. His boots were regulation perfect, polished to mirror brightness, but showing none of the scuff marks that accumulated from scrambling across flight, lines and climbing into cramped cockpit spaces. "Marcus," Diana replied, using his first name deliberately to establish that her return carried authority that transcended their previous relationship. "I'll need access to my old aircraft and a briefing on whatever intelligence you have about the hijacking situation." Webb's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly at her informal address, but he nodded professionally. "Your F-16, tail number 847 Alpha, has been maintained in museum condition rather than operational status. We'll need approximately 4 hours to bring all systems online and complete pre-flight preparations. The aircraft hasn't been flown in combat configuration since your last deployment." They walked toward the hangar complex where Diana's old aircraft waited, passing groups of younger pilots who watched their conversation with undisguised curiosity. Word of her return had obviously spread quickly through the base's communication networks, creating the kind of buzz that surrounded unexpected developments in military routine. Diana could see the questions in their eyes, the speculation about why a retired pilot had been recalled for a mission that had already claimed multiple aircraft and crews. Major Jessica Martinez, one of Diana's former students who had risen through the ranks despite the institutional changes, approached with barely contained excitement. Martinez had been one of the few younger officers who had embraced Diana's emphasis on fundamental flying skills, understanding that technological sophistication was only as reliable as the systems supporting it. "Colonel Vasquez," Martinez said, her voice carrying genuine warmth and respect, "it's incredible to see you back here. We've been following the situation with the hijacked aircraft, and honestly, nobody knew what to do after we lost contact with Bravo Squadron." Diana studied Martinez's expression, seeing both professional concern and personal relief. The younger officer had clearly been struggling with the tactical challenges that had defeated the base's other pilots, recognizing that her training had prepared her for scenarios where technology worked perfectly, but not for situations where adversaries exploited technological weaknesses. "Jessica, what's your assessment of the failures we've experienced so far?" Diana asked, using the question as an opportunity to understand how the current generation of pilots was analyzing the crisis. Martinez glanced at Colonel Webb before responding, clearly aware that her answer might be interpreted as criticism of current training programs and tactical doctrines. "Ma'am, from what we've been able to determine, the hijackers seem to understand our intercept protocols better than we understand their evasion capabilities. Every time our pilots have established radar contact, they've lost it within minutes. The aircraft appears to be using some kind of electronic countermeasures that interfere with our tracking systems." Webb interrupted with the kind of authoritative tone that suggested he'd been having this conversation repeatedly over the past few days. "Our analysis indicates sophisticated jamming equipment, possibly state-sponsored technology that exceeds anything we've encountered in training scenarios. The hijackers are operating with resources and capabilities that suggest military-level backing." Diana nodded thoughtfully, but her tactical instincts suggested a different explanation. During her years commanding Pacific theater operations, she'd encountered situations where apparent technological sophistication was actually elegant simplicity that exploited the complexity of modern systems. Sometimes the most effective countermeasures were the oldest ones, techniques that predated the technologies they were designed to defeat. "Have you considered the possibility that they're not using advanced jamming equipment?" Diana asked. "What if they're simply exploiting predictable patterns in our intercept procedures?" The suggestion hung in the air like a challenge to everything the current military establishment believed about technological superiority and modern warfare tactics. Webb's expression suggested he was struggling to process the implications of Diana's question, while Martinez looked intrigued by the possibility that their failures might have simpler explanations than enemy technological advancement. "Colonel, with respect," Webb said, his tone carrying the patient condescension usually reserved for explaining obvious facts to confused civilians. "Our intercept protocols are based on the most advanced tactical analysis systems available. They incorporate real-time data from multiple satellite networks, predictive algorithms that analyze flight patterns, and coordination capabilities that allow multiple aircraft to operate as integrated units." Diana smiled slightly, recognizing the same kind of absolute confidence in technological systems that had characterized military thinking during her final years of service. It was the same confidence that had led to her forced retirement when she'd questioned whether increasing reliance on complex systems might create vulnerabilities that simpler approaches could avoid. "Marcus, what happens when those sophisticated systems encounter something they weren't designed to handle?" Diana asked. "What happens when the predictive algorithms are fed data that doesn't match their training parameters, or when the real-time satellite networks are compromised by adversaries who understand their limitations?" The hangar where her F-16 waited was a monument to the evolution of military aviation technology. Surrounding her aircraft were newer F-22 Raptors and F-35 Lightning fighters, machines that represented billions of dollars in research and development aimed at creating the most technologically advanced combat aircraft in human history. Their sleek profiles and sophisticated avionics packages embodied everything modern about contemporary air power. Diana's F-16, by comparison, looked like a relic from an earlier era. The aircraft's lines were classic rather than cutting-edge, its systems analog rather than digital, its capabilities proven through decades of combat rather than validated through computer modeling. But as she approached the familiar cockpit where she'd spent thousands of hours, Diana felt the comfortable recognition of tools designed for reliability rather than sophistication. Technical Sergeant Rodriguez, who had maintained Diana's aircraft since her early days at Thunderbolt, emerged from beneath the wing with the satisfied expression of someone who took pride in keeping older systems operational. Rodriguez had resisted multiple attempts to transfer him to newer aircraft, arguing that maintaining complex digital systems required different skills than understanding the mechanical relationships that made aircraft actually fly. "Colonel, she's been waiting for you," Rodriguez said, patting the aircraft's fuselage with the affection usually reserved for family members. "Every system has been maintained to original specifications, plus a few improvements I've made over the past 18 months. She fly exactly like you remember, maybe a little better." Diana climbed into the cockpit and immediately felt the muscle memory that came from thousands of hours in similar spaces. Every switch and gauge was exactly where her hands expected to find them. Every control surface responded with the mechanical precision that analog systems provided. There were no holographic displays or computer-generated flight paths, just instruments that showed her exactly what the aircraft was doing without digital interpretation or algorithmic filtering. "Colonel," Webb watched from below as Diana conducted her pre-flight inspection, his expression suggesting he was struggling to understand how anyone could prefer the apparent simplicity of older systems to the comprehensive capabilities of modern avionics. To him, Diana's aircraft represented everything outdated about traditional military thinking. A museum piece that lacked the technological advantages necessary for contemporary warfare. But as Diana ran through her mental checklist of systems and procedures, she felt the kind of confidence that came from understanding every component and knowing exactly how each one would behave under stress. Modern aircraft were undoubtedly more capable in ideal conditions, but ideal conditions rarely existed when lives depended on performance under pressure. Major Martinez climbed onto the wing to observe Diana's preparation process, clearly interested in understanding how someone approached flying with fundamentally different assumptions about technology and pilot responsibility. "Colonel, what's the biggest difference between flying this aircraft and the newer fighters?" Diana looked up from her instrument check, considering how to explain decades of experience in a way that younger pilots could understand. "Jessica, in newer aircraft, the computer makes most of the flying decisions and the pilot manages the systems. In this aircraft, the pilot makes the flying decisions and manages the computer as one tool among many. When everything works perfectly, the modern approach is more efficient. When things go wrong, traditional approaches give you more options." The briefing room where Diana received her mission parameters had been completely renovated since her departure, transformed from a functional space with paper charts and manual plotting tools into a digital command center with wall-mounted displays and computerized tactical analysis systems. The contrast highlighted how dramatically military culture had shifted toward dependence on technological solutions for problems that had traditionally been solved through human judgment and experience. Intelligence Officer Captain Sarah Kim presented the latest information about the hijacked aircraft using a sophisticated presentation system that integrated real-time satellite feeds, predictive modeling, and automated threat analysis. The technology was impressive, but Diana noticed that the actual useful information could have been conveyed just as effectively using traditional briefing methods that didn't require computer systems or digital networks. "Based on our current analysis," Kim explained, highlighting flight paths on a large digital display, "the hijackers are following an erratic course that suggests either pilot incapacitation or deliberate evasion tactics. Standard intercept protocols have been unsuccessful because we can't predict their flight path or maintain consistent radar contact." Diana studied the displayed information, but her tactical analysis was based on patterns she'd learned to recognize through experience rather than computer modeling. The hijackers' flight path wasn't random or erratic. It was carefully designed to exploit the weaknesses in modern intercept procedures that depended on predictable behavior and technological tracking methods. "Captain Kim, what if the hijackers aren't trying to evade our technology?" Diana asked. "What if they're simply forcing our pilots to fly in conditions where technological advantages become technological liabilities?" The question challenged fundamental assumptions about how modern air combat worked, suggesting that adversaries might achieve superiority not by matching technological capabilities, but by creating situations where those capabilities became disadvantages rather than assets. As the briefing concluded and Diana prepared for a mission that would test everything she'd learned about flying and survival, she reflected on the institutional changes that had led to her forced retirement and sudden recall. The same military leadership that had deemed her methods obsolete was now desperately hoping that those obsolete methods could succeed. Where modern approaches had failed catastrophically, the transformation of Thunderbolt Air Force Base over the past 18 months reflected a broader institutional shift that had been accelerating throughout Diana's final years of service. What had once been a culture that valued experience and judgment had systematically evolved into an environment where youth, technological fluency, and adherence to digital protocols determined career advancement and operational authority. The change wasn't accidental. It was the result of deliberate policy decisions made by Pentagon officials who believed that modern warfare required a complete break from traditional military thinking. General Patricia Morrison, the architect of the modernization program that had effectively ended Diana's career, had built her reputation on speeches about transforming military culture for the digital age. Morrison's vision emphasized data-driven decision-making, algorithmic tactical planning, and pilot training. Programs that prioritize systems management over fundamental flying skills. She had personally overseen Diana's final evaluation, where 32 years of combat experience had been weighed against metrics that measured adaptability to new technologies and willingness to abandon traditional methods. Captain James Foster, one of the youngest squadron leaders in Thunderbolt's history, embodied everything Morrison's modernization program was designed to produce. At 28, Foster had graduated from the Air Force Academy's Accelerated Digital Warfare program, completed advanced training on integrated combat systems, and demonstrated exceptional proficiency with computer-assisted targeting and automated navigation protocols. His squadron had achieved perfect scores in simulated combat scenarios and held multiple records for precision during training exercises conducted under controlled conditions. Foster's pilots represented the elite of contemporary military aviation. Technologically sophisticated, procedurally disciplined, and supremely confident in their abilities to handle any situation their training had prepared them to encounter. They flew the most advanced aircraft ever built, equipped with systems that could process more information in seconds than previous generations of pilots had access to during entire missions. Their pre-flight briefings resembled high-tech presentations, more than traditional tactical planning sessions, with holographic displays showing predicted enemy movements and computer-generated, optimal response scenarios. Diana's attempts to share her concerns about over-dependence on technology had been systematically dismissed by this new generation of military leadership. During her final months of service, she had requested permission to maintain training programs in manual navigation, basic instrument flying, and emergency procedures that didn't rely on computer assistance. Each request had been denied with explanations that such training was inefficient, outdated, and potentially counterproductive for pilots who needed to focus on mastering modern systems. The institutional resistance to Diana's perspective had been particularly evident during a heated exchange with Colonel Webb 6 months before her forced retirement. Webb had openly questioned whether pilots who relied on primitive navigation methods could effectively integrate with modern combat formations that depended on real-time data sharing and coordinated digital communications. He had argued that maintaining proficiency in manual skills actually hindered pilot development because it encouraged reliance on individual judgment rather than systematic adherence to proven technological protocols. Colonel Vasquez, Webb had said during that confrontation, his voice carrying the kind of patient exasperation usually reserved for explaining obvious concepts to slow learners, we're training pilots for warfare scenarios that will be fought with weapons and tactics that didn't exist when you were learning to fly. The enemy we're preparing to face will have capabilities that make traditional dogfighting skills irrelevant. Our pilots need to think like systems integrators, not like individual warriors. Diana had responded by pointing out that enemies also evolved, that adversaries specifically studied American technological advantages to identify exploitable weaknesses, and that backup capabilities became critical when primary systems failed under conditions that computer models couldn't predict. But her arguments had been characterized as resistance to progress, nostalgia for outdated methods, and evidence that she couldn't adapt to contemporary military requirements. The dismissal hadn't been sudden or dramatic. Instead, it had been accomplished through a gradual erosion of Diana's authority and influence that made her position increasingly untenable. Her recommendations were consistently overruled by officers with less experience, but greater facility with digital systems. Her training programs were defunded and replaced with computer-based simulations that emphasized technological proficiency over fundamental skills. Her tactical assessments were dismissed as irrelevant to modern warfare scenarios that would be dominated by technological rather than human factors. Lieutenant Commander Rachel Stevens, one of the few pilots who had trained under Diana's programs and achieved recognition in the new system, had privately expressed frustration with the institutional changes that prioritized technological capability over comprehensive pilot development. Stevens had witnessed the gradual elimination of training that emphasized problem-solving under adverse conditions, noting that modern pilots were exceptionally skilled at managing complex systems, but often struggled when those systems failed or provided contradictory information. "Colonel, we're creating pilots who are essentially computer operators," Stevens had confided during one of their last conversations before Diana's retirement. "They're incredibly good at what they do when everything works according to plan, but they've never been taught to fly by instinct or make tactical decisions without algorithmic support. I worry about what happens when they encounter situations that aren't covered in their training databases." Diana's concerns had proven prophetic in smaller incidents that had occurred throughout her final year of service. Training exercises had revealed troubling patterns where pilots became disoriented when GPS systems experienced interference, where formation flying deteriorated when communication networks experienced technical difficulties, and where emergency procedures were delayed when computer systems provided conflicting information. Each incident had been dismissed as an anomaly rather than recognized as evidence of systematic vulnerabilities in training that emphasized technological dependence over fundamental competence. The culture change had been most evident in how younger pilots approached problem-solving when faced with unexpected situations. Traditional military training had emphasized adaptability, improvisation, and the ability to complete missions despite equipment failures or changing circumstances. Modern training focused on procedural compliance, systematic troubleshooting, and reliance on technological solutions for tactical challenges. The new approach worked exceptionally well when conditions matched training parameters, but created potentially dangerous gaps when reality diverged from program scenarios. Major Anthony Rodriguez, a 15-year veteran who had served under Diana's command during multiple deployments, had been one of the few experienced officers to voice support for maintaining traditional training elements alongside modern technological education. Rodriguez had argued that pilot development should include both digital proficiency and fundamental flying skills, suggesting that comprehensive training would produce more capable aviators than specialized focus on either approach alone. "Ma'am, we're essentially putting all our eggs in one technological basket," Rodriguez had said during a training review meeting that had become contentious when Diana questioned the elimination of manual navigation requirements. "If that basket fails during a critical mission, our pilots won't have the backup skills they need to complete their objectives or survive adverse conditions." But Rodriguez's support had been insufficient to prevent the institutional momentum that favored complete modernization over balanced training approaches. Pentagon directives had specifically mandated the elimination of training programs that were deemed inconsistent with digital warfare protocols, and base commanders were evaluated based on their success in implementing these modernization requirements. Supporting Diana's traditional training methods had become a career liability for officers who wanted advancement within the new system. The final evaluation that ended Diana's career had been conducted by a panel of officers who had never flown combat missions under the conditions that had shaped her tactical judgment. They had assessed her performance using metrics that emphasized technological adaptation and procedural compliance rather than mission success rates or pilot development outcomes. Her attempts to explain why experience-based judgment remained relevant in contemporary warfare had been characterized as resistance to necessary institutional evolution. General Morrison had delivered the final verdict with the kind of professional courtesy that barely concealed institutional relief at removing an obstacle to complete modernization. Colonel Vasquez, your service record speaks for itself, and the Air Force recognizes your contributions during an earlier era of military aviation. However, contemporary warfare requires different capabilities and institutional approaches. We believe your transition to civilian status will benefit both your personal development and our organizational evolution. The dismissal had been devastating, not just professionally but personally, representing the rejection of everything Diana had learned about military service and pilot development over 3 decades of dedication to institutional excellence. She had devoted her adult life to developing capabilities that were suddenly deemed irrelevant by people who had never tested those capabilities under the conditions where they became essential for survival and mission success. Captain Foster's squadron, which had been specifically created to demonstrate the superiority of modernized training approaches, had become the poster unit for Pentagon promotional materials that emphasized technological advancement over traditional military virtues. Their aircraft were equipped with the most sophisticated systems available. Their pilots had achieved perfect scores on standardized evaluation protocols, and their unit had been featured in recruitment videos that highlighted the scientific precision of contemporary air combat. But Foster's pilots had never been tested under conditions that challenged their fundamental flying abilities rather than their technological proficiency. Their training had been conducted in controlled environments, where variables were carefully managed to ensure optimal performance, where equipment functioned according to specifications, and where tactical scenarios unfolded according to predictable parameters that could be analyzed and optimized through computer modeling. Diana's forced retirement had been celebrated by modernization advocates as evidence that the Air Force was successfully transitioning away from outdated approaches towards systematic methods that could be scaled, standardized, and improved through technological advancement. Her departure had eliminated one of the last institutional voices arguing for balanced training that included both modern systems and traditional backup capabilities. The irony of her current recall was that the crisis overwhelming Foster's technologically superior pilots required exactly the kind of experience-based judgment and fundamental flying skills that modernization programs had systematically eliminated from contemporary training. The hijackers had created conditions where technological sophistication became a liability rather than an advantage, where procedural compliance led to failure rather than success, and where survival required the kind of adaptability that could only be developed through experience rather than simulation. As Diana prepared to demonstrate that the capabilities deemed obsolete by institutional leaders remained essential for missions where lives depended on pilot competence rather than computer performance, she reflected on the broader implications of military organizations that prioritized efficiency over effectiveness, standardization over adaptability, and technological capability over human judgment. Developed through decades of experience under adverse conditions, Diana's first indication that the hijacking crisis was more complex than official briefings suggested came during her private conversation with intelligence analyst Dr. Catherine Walsh, a civilian contractor who had been quietly documenting patterns in the failed intercept attempts that didn't align with standard threat assessments. Walsh approached Diana in the secure briefing facility with the cautious demeanor of someone who had important information but lacked the institutional authority to ensure it would be taken seriously by military decision-makers. "Colonel Vasquez," Walsh said, glancing around to ensure their conversation wouldn't be overheard by other personnel. "I've been analyzing the flight data from the aircraft we've lost, and there's something about this situation that doesn't match what we're being told about sophisticated enemy jamming technology." Walsh opened a classified tablet displaying radar tracking data from the failed intercept missions, pointing to specific patterns that had emerged during each encounter with the hijacked aircraft. The data showed that American pilots had initially established contact successfully, maintaining visual and radar tracking for several minutes before experiencing the systematic failures that had led to their disappearance over the Pacific Ocean. Look at these timestamps, Walsh continued, highlighting specific moments when tracking had been lost. The failures aren't random or instantaneous like you'd expect from electronic jamming. They follow a predictable sequence that suggests the hijackers are exploiting specific procedural vulnerabilities rather than overwhelming our technology with superior equipment. Diana studied the data with growing recognition of tactical patterns she'd encountered during her years commanding Pacific theater operations. The hijackers weren't using brute force technological attacks against American systems. They were creating conditions that forced American pilots to rely on exactly the technological capabilities that could be most easily compromised or confused through relatively simple countermeasures. Dr. Walsh, what's the official explanation for these pattern anomalies? Diana asked, though she suspected the answer would reveal institutional blind spots that had contributed to the mission failures. Command insists that we're facing state-sponsored electronic warfare capabilities that exceed our current defensive parameters, Walsh replied. But that explanation requires assumptions about enemy technological advancement that don't match intelligence assessments from other sources. The simpler explanation is that someone with intimate knowledge of our tactical procedures is specifically targeting the decision-making processes that our pilots have been trained to follow. The implications of Walsh's analysis were disturbing, because they suggested that the hijackers possessed detailed understanding of American military training protocols, equipment capabilities, and operational procedures. This knowledge could have been acquired through intelligence gathering, but it could also indicate involvement by someone with direct experience in American military aviation, who understood exactly how contemporary pilots would respond to specific tactical situations. Diana requested access to the complete communication transcripts from the failed intercept missions, documents that had been classified at levels that prevented most base personnel from reviewing them. The transcripts revealed conversations between American pilots that demonstrated exceptional technical competence and procedural compliance right up until the moments when their missions had ended in catastrophic failure. Captain Bradley Morrison, the pilot who had led the first failed intercept attempt, had followed established protocols with textbook precision. His communications showed systematic coordination with ground control, proper implementation of identification procedures, and appropriate use of technological systems for maintaining contact with the target aircraft. But the transcript also revealed moments when Morrison had encountered situations that required improvisation rather than procedural compliance, and these were the moments when his mission had begun to deteriorate. Tower, I'm showing intermittent radar contact, Morrison had reported during the critical phase of his intercept mission. Target aircraft appears to be maneuvering in patterns that don't match our predictive algorithms. Requesting guidance. Unmodified approach vectors. Ground control's response had directed Morrison to maintain standard intercept procedures and rely on his aircraft's automated tracking systems to compensate for target maneuvering. The guidance reflected institutional confidence that technological solutions could handle any tactical challenges that arose during the mission, but the subsequent loss of contact suggested that this confidence had been misplaced when faced with adversaries who understood how to exploit technological dependencies. Lieutenant Sarah Chun, who had participated in the second failed intercept mission, had encountered similar difficulties when her target began executing maneuvers that confused her aircraft's predictive targeting systems. Chun's communications revealed a pilot who was exceptionally skilled at managing complex technological systems but struggled when those systems provided contradictory or unreliable information that required independent tactical judgment to resolve. Control. My targeting computer is showing multiple possible intercept courses, Chun had transmitted during the final minutes of communication with her aircraft. The algorithms are cycling through different solutions without converging on a recommended approach. Should I proceed with manual targeting or wait for system resolution? The response from ground control had instructed Chen to trust her technological systems and allow the automated processes to resolve the conflicting data. But Diana's analysis of the transcript suggested that Chen had needed permission to rely on her own tactical judgment rather than wait for computer systems to provide solutions that might never come. Major David Foster, Captain Foster's older brother who had led the most recent failed intercept mission, had transmitted information that provided crucial insights into how the hijackers were defeating American technological advantages. Foster's aircraft had maintained contact with the target longer than previous missions, allowing him to observe tactical patterns that revealed the hijackers' methodology. Tower, the target aircraft is using our own intercept protocols against us, Foster had reported with growing urgency in his voice. Every time I establish a standard approach vector, they execute countermeasures that specifically target the predictable elements of our tactical procedures. It's like they know exactly what we're going to do before we do it. Foster's observation suggested that the hijackers possessed detailed knowledge of American military training and tactical doctrine, enabling them to predict how American pilots would respond to specific situations and prepare countermeasures that exploited the procedural predictability of contemporary military operations. This knowledge gave them decisive advantages that didn't require technological superiority, just understanding of how American pilots had been trained to think and react. Diana's review of maintenance records for the lost aircraft revealed additional concerning patterns that hadn't been emphasized in official briefings about the mission failures. All of the aircraft had been equipped with the most advanced technological systems available, but those systems had been designed to function optimally under conditions where they could operate according to their programming parameters without interference or unexpected variables. Technical Sergeant Maria Rodriguez, who had maintained several of the lost aircraft, provided Diana with detailed assessments of how the advanced systems performed when faced with situations that hadn't been anticipated during their design and testing phases. Rodriguez's analysis suggested that technological sophistication sometimes created vulnerabilities that simpler systems could avoid. Colonel, these new aircraft are incredible when everything works according to plan, Rodriguez explained while reviewing maintenance logs from the failed missions. But they're also more complex than older systems, which means there are more potential failure points when conditions don't match what the computers expect to encounter. Rodriguez's concerns about technological complexity creating operational vulnerabilities echoed warnings that Diana had raised during her final years of service, arguments that had been dismissed as resistance to necessary modernization. But the current crisis was demonstrating that those warnings had identified real risks that could become critical when adversaries understood how to exploit the relationships between technological capability and operational flexibility. Dr. Walsh's continued analysis of the intercept failures had revealed additional patterns that suggested the hijackers were using psychological as well as technological tactics to defeat American pilots. The timing of their countermeasures appeared designed to create stress and confusion during the specific moments when American pilots were most dependent on their technological systems for tactical guidance. They're not just jamming our equipment, Walsh explained during a follow-up briefing that Diana attended, despite lacking official authorization to participate in ongoing intelligence assessments. They're creating situations where our pilots lose confidence in their systems at exactly the moments when they need to make critical decisions. It's psychological warfare that exploits our institutional dependence on technology. The psychological dimension of the hijackers' tactics had been largely ignored by official analysis that focused on technological explanations for the mission failures. But Diana recognized the approach from her own experience with adversaries who had understood that defeating American military capabilities often required targeting the decision-making processes of individual pilots, rather than overwhelming their equipment with superior technology. Captain Jennifer Martinez, one of Diana's former students who had managed to avoid assignment to the failed intercept missions, approached her with additional insights into how the current generation of pilots had been trained to handle unexpected situations. Martinez's observations confirmed Diana's suspicions that modern training had created systematic vulnerabilities that could be exploited by adversaries who understood contemporary military education and tactical doctrine. "Colonel, we've been trained to trust our systems and follow established procedures," Martinez explained during a private conversation in the base's maintenance facility. "That training works incredibly well when conditions match what we've practiced. But it creates problems when we encounter situations that require improvisation or independent judgment. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel." Martinez described training scenarios where pilots had practiced responding to equipment failures, but always within controlled environments where the failures followed predictable patterns and solutions were available through systematic troubleshooting procedures. The current crisis was presenting failures that didn't match training parameters and required tactical adaptability that hadn't been emphasized in contemporary pilot development programs. Diana's growing understanding of the tactical situation revealed that the hijackers had created what military strategists called a systems defeat scenario, where they achieved superiority not through technological advancement, but by forcing their opponents to fight under conditions where technological advantages became disadvantages. This approach required intimate knowledge of American military capabilities and training, suggesting either extensive intelligence gathering or direct insider knowledge of contemporary pilot development and tactical doctrine. The crisis was exposing fundamental questions about military training philosophy that extended far beyond the immediate challenge of intercepting a single hijacked aircraft. If American pilots could be systematically defeated by adversaries who understood how to exploit technological dependencies and procedural predictability, then the entire modernization program that had shaped contemporary military aviation might require reevaluation. As Diana prepared to demonstrate whether experience-based tactical judgment could succeed where technologically advanced approaches had failed, she reflected on the broader implications of a military system that had systematically eliminated the very capabilities that appeared necessary for handling the current crisis. The hijackers had essentially conducted a real-world test of American military training and institutional priorities, and the results had revealed vulnerabilities that could affect national security far beyond this single incident. The crisis reached its breaking point at 14:47 Pacific Standard Time, when ground control lost all communication with Echo Squadron, the most elite unit that Thunderbolt Base could deploy. Captain Foster had led 4 F-22 Raptors into what should have been a routine intercept mission, equipped with the most sophisticated tracking technology and weapon systems that American military engineering could provide. The aircraft represented over $2 billion in advanced technology, piloted by officers who had achieved perfect scores in every training scenario and simulation exercise they had ever attempted. The radio transmission that marked the beginning of the catastrophe had been deceptively routine. "Thunder Control, this is Echo Leader," Foster had reported with the calm professionalism that characterized all his communications. "We have visual contact with the target aircraft at bearing 270, range approximately 15 nautical miles. Target appears to be a Boeing 777 maintaining level flight at flight level 350. Ground control had responded with standard intercept protocol instructions, directing Foster's squadron to establish visual identification while maintaining safe separation distances. The procedures had been developed through decades of experience and refined through countless training exercises designed to ensure that intercept missions could be completed safely and effectively without risking civilian casualties or international incidents. But within minutes of establishing contact, Foster's confident communications had begun showing signs of confusion and increasing urgency that indicated something was fundamentally wrong with the tactical situation. Thunder Control, we're experiencing some unusual readings on our navigation systems, Foster had transmitted, his voice carrying the first hints of uncertainty that anyone at Thunderbolt Base had ever heard from him. Navigation anomalies had escalated rapidly into complete system failures that left Foster's technologically advanced aircraft operating with severely compromised capabilities. Control, all 4 aircraft are showing different positions on GPS, Foster had reported with growing alarm. Our formation integrity is breaking down because we can't maintain accurate relative positioning. Diana listened to the recorded transmissions. In the base's communication center, recognizing tactical patterns that she had encountered during her own combat missions in environments where electronic warfare had made sophisticated navigation systems unreliable. The hijackers weren't using advanced jamming technology. They were creating electromagnetic interference that specifically targeted the frequency ranges and signal processing methods that American military aircraft depended on for coordinated operations. Colonel Webb monitored the developing crisis from the base's Tactical Operations Center, surrounded by displays showing satellite feeds, radar tracking data, and communication logs that painted an increasingly desperate picture of America's most advanced pilots struggling against an adversary who seemed to understand their every weakness. Webb's confidence in technological superiority was visibly cracking as he watched his elite pilots become progressively more disoriented and ineffective. Echo Leader, maintain visual contact and ignore navigation discrepancies. Ground Control had instructed, following established protocols for dealing with equipment malfunctions during critical missions. But the guidance assumed that pilots could compensate for technological failures using fundamental flying skills that contemporary training had systematically de-emphasized in favor of systems management and procedural compliance. Foster's response had revealed the extent to which modern pilot training had created dependencies that became liabilities when technology failed. Control, we're having difficulty maintaining formation without GPS reference, he had transmitted. Our flight computers are providing conflicting altitude and heading information. Request permission to abort the mission and return to base. The request for mission abort had triggered intense debate in the Tactical Operations Center between officers who wanted to preserve valuable aircraft and pilots versus those who recognized that allowing the hijacked aircraft to continue toward American airspace could result in catastrophic consequences. The decision-making process had consumed precious minutes while Foster's squadron became increasingly scattered and disoriented over the Pacific Ocean. Lieutenant Commander Stevens, monitoring communications from the backup control position, had attempted to provide Foster's pilots with manual navigation guidance based on traditional methods that didn't rely on electronic systems. Echo Squadron, this is backup control, Stevens had transmitted. Recommend you establish visual reference points and use dead reckoning navigation to maintain formation integrity. But Foster's pilots had never been trained in dead reckoning navigation beyond basic theoretical knowledge that hadn't been practiced under stress conditions. Their attempts to implement manual navigation techniques had been hesitant and ineffective, revealing gaps in fundamental flying skills that had been considered unnecessary in an era of reliable electronic navigation systems. Backup control. We're not trained for manual navigation information flight, Foster had admitted, his voice carrying embarrassment at acknowledging limitations that exposed deficiencies in contemporary training programs. Our standard procedures assume functional GPS and automated formation keeping systems. The admission had sent shockwaves through the Tactical Operations Center because it revealed that America's most elite pilots lacked basic capabilities that had been considered essential for military aviators throughout most of aviation history. The modernization programs that had eliminated traditional navigation training had created vulnerabilities that adversaries could exploit through relatively simple interference with electronic systems. Diana's analysis of the deteriorating situation had led her to request immediate permission to launch her own intercept mission using her older F-16 that relied on analog navigation systems and manual flight controls. But Colonel Webb had initially refused her request, arguing that deploying obsolete equipment would only add another aircraft to the growing list of losses without providing any tactical advantages over the sophisticated systems that were already failing. Colonel Vasquez, your aircraft lacks the advanced tracking and communication capabilities that our current pilots are trained to use, Webb had argued during a heated exchange in the operations center. Adding a 40-year-old aircraft to this situation will only complicate coordination efforts and put another pilot at risk. Diana's response had challenged the fundamental assumptions about technological superiority that had shaped contemporary military aviation doctrine. Marcus, your advanced systems are being systematically defeated by an adversary who understands their weaknesses, she had pointed out. Sometimes the most advanced solution is to use technology that's too simple for sophisticated countermeasures to target effectively. The debate had been interrupted by increasingly desperate transmissions from Echo Squadron as Foster's pilots had encountered the same systematic targeting that had claimed previous intercept missions. Thunder Control, Echo 3 is experiencing complete navigation failure. One pilot had reported with barely controlled panic in his voice. All electronic systems are showing error messages. I can't determine my position or heading. Echo Squadrons. Disintegration had accelerated as individual pilots had lost confidence in their systems and their ability to maintain coordinated flight operations. The psychological pressure of operating with unreliable technology had compounded the technical challenges, creating a cascade of failures that had overwhelmed even the most skilled pilots when they encountered situations that their training hadn't prepared them to handle. Control, this is Echo 4, another pilot had transmitted with increasing urgency. I've lost sight of the formation and my radar is showing multiple false contacts. Request immediate vector back to base before I run out of fuel searching for aircraft that might not be where my systems say they are. The fuel situation had created additional time pressure because Foster's squadron had been operating at maximum range, leaving minimal reserves for extended search operations or navigation errors. Modern aircraft achieved their performance advantages partly through optimized fuel efficiency that assumed precise navigation and coordinated flight operations. But these efficiencies became liabilities when pilots needed extra fuel to compensate for navigation uncertainties. Diana's growing frustration with institutional paralysis had led her to make direct contact with the Pentagon officials who had authorized her recall to active duty. Deputy Defense Secretary Chun had listened to Diana's tactical assessment with growing alarm as she realized that the same modernization programs that had been promoted as essential for national security had created systematic vulnerabilities that threatened mission success. Madam Secretary, we're losing aircraft because our pilots have been trained to depend on systems that can be compromised by adversaries who understand contemporary American military doctrine, Diana had explained during an encrypted communication with Pentagon Command Authority. The hijackers aren't using superior technology. They're exploiting predictable weaknesses in our institutional approach to pilot training and tactical operations. Chun's response had reflected the growing recognition among senior defense officials that the crisis represented more than a single hijacking incident. Colonel Vasquez, are you saying that our entire modernization program has created vulnerabilities that could affect other military operations? The question had forced Diana to articulate concerns that she had been raising unsuccessfully for years before her forced retirement. Ma'am, we've created military capabilities that are exceptionally effective under ideal conditions, but potentially vulnerable when adversaries force us to operate outside The parameters that our technology and training assume will remain constant. The final transmission from Echo Squadron had come at 15:23 Pacific Standard Time when Foster had attempted to describe the tactical situation that had overwhelmed his technologically superior aircraft. Thunder Control, the target aircraft, is using our own procedures against us, he had reported with the exhausted resignation of someone who finally understood how completely he had been outmaneuvered. Every time we attempt standard intercept approaches, they execute countermeasures that specifically target our technological dependencies, Foster had continued. It's like fighting an enemy who has copies of all our training manuals and knows exactly how we've been taught to respond to every situation. The transmission had ended with Foster's aircraft disappearing from radar contact, joining the growing list of American military assets that had been lost to an adversary who had achieved tactical superiority through understanding rather than overwhelming technological capability. Echo Squadron's failure had represented the complete collapse of contemporary American military aviation doctrine when faced with enemies who understood how to exploit the systematic weaknesses that modernization programs had inadvertently created. As Diana finally received authorization to launch her own intercept mission using methods and equipment that had been dismissed as obsolete, she reflected on the tragic irony that America's most advanced military pilots had been defeated not by superior enemy technology but by their own institutional dependence on systems that could be compromised by adversaries who understood the psychological and procedural patterns that contemporary training had made predictable. The crisis had evolved beyond a simple hijacking incident into a fundamental test of whether military institutions could adapt quickly enough to acknowledge that technological advancement without corresponding development of human judgment and fundamental skills had created vulnerabilities that could be exploited by enemies who understood American military culture better than American military leaders understood themselves. Diana's F-16 lifted off from Thunderbolt Air Force Base at 16:42 Pacific Standard Time, climbing in disguise that had already claimed 13 American aircraft and pilots in the span of 72 hours. Her aircraft felt solid and responsive beneath her hands, every control surface responding with the mechanical precision that came from decades of proven engineering rather than the algorithmic interpretation that characterized modern fly-by-wire systems. The familiar weight of analog instruments and manual flight controls provided a sense of reliable connection between pilot and machine that had been largely eliminated from contemporary military aviation. Unlike the pilots who had preceded her into this tactical nightmare, Diana approached the intercept mission with fundamental assumptions that differed dramatically from contemporary military doctrine. Her navigation relied on compass headings, celestial reference points, and dead reckoning calculations that she performed manually using techniques that predated satellite navigation systems. Her tactical planning incorporated variables and contingencies that couldn't be programmed into computer algorithms because they required judgment based on experience with situations where standard procedures had proven inadequate. The flight toward the hijacked aircraft's last known position took Diana over Pacific waters where debris fields marked the locations where America's most advanced fighters had met their end. Satellite imagery had confirmed the destruction of multiple F-22 Raptors and F-35 Lightning fighters, aircraft that represented the pinnacle of technological achievement, but had been rendered ineffective by an adversary who understood how to exploit their sophisticated systems against them. Diana's radio communications with ground control followed protocols that emphasized information sharing rather than technological coordination. Thunder Control, Phoenix leader establishing independent navigation track toward the target's projected position. She transmitted using call signs that hadn't been heard in operational context for over a decade. Maintaining radio contact on backup frequencies to ensure communication redundancy. The backup communication systems that Diana employed had been considered obsolete by modern standards, but they operated on frequency ranges and signal processing methods that were less vulnerable to the electronic interference that had disrupted previous intercept attempts. Her approach reflected tactical thinking that assumed technology would fail at critical moments and prepared alternative methods for maintaining mission capability when primary systems became unreliable. Ground control's response revealed the extent to which contemporary military operations had become dependent on technological coordination that Diana's methods circumvented entirely. Phoenix Leader were unable to provide real-time navigation updates or tactical coordination using current tracking systems, the controller admitted. You'll be operating independently once you reach the target area. Diana's tactical analysis of the situation drew from experiences that no contemporary pilot possessed. Combat missions where electronic warfare had made sophisticated navigation systems unreliable. Intercept operations conducted using visual identification and manual flight controls, and survival situations where technology had failed completely and mission success had depended entirely on pilot skill and judgment developed through years of flying under adverse conditions. Her approach to the intercept differed fundamentally from the systematic procedures that had been followed by previous missions. Instead of relying on predictable flight patterns and automated coordination, Diana planned to use irregular approaches that would be difficult for the hijackers to anticipate or counter using their apparent knowledge of standard American military tactics, the first indication that Diana's methods might succeed. Where others had failed came when she established visual contact with the target aircraft at a range that previous intercept missions had never achieved. The Boeing 777 appeared exactly where her manual calculations had predicted, flying a course that reflected sophisticated understanding of how to exploit the weaknesses in American tracking and intercept capabilities. Thunder Control. Phoenix Leader has visual contact with target aircraft. Diana transmitted, her voice carrying the calm confidence that came from operating within her areas of expertise rather than struggling with unfamiliar technological systems. Target is maintaining flight level 350, heading approximately 090 degrees, airspeed consistent with normal cruise configuration. Unlike previous pilots who had immediately experienced navigation and communication difficulties upon approaching the target, Diana's analog systems continued functioning, normally because they operated independently of the electronic systems that the hijackers had learned to compromise. Her aircraft's mechanical flight controls and basic instrumentation provided reliable feedback that allowed her to maintain precise formation, flying without dependence on automated systems. Diana's tactical assessment of the hijacked aircraft revealed details that previous missions had been unable to observe due to their rapid system failures and disorientation. The Boeing 777 showed no external signs of damage or modification, suggesting that the hijackers were using the aircraft's existing systems rather than installed equipment to create the electronic interference that had defeated American military technology. Her analysis of the hijackers' flight patterns revealed sophisticated tactical knowledge that confirmed her suspicions about insider involvement in the operation. The aircraft's maneuvering demonstrated intimate familiarity with American intercept procedures, timing countermeasures to coincide with the moments when American pilots would be most dependent on their technological systems for tactical guidance. Control. Target aircraft are executing evasive maneuvers that specifically exploit standard intercept protocols, Diana reported, her observations providing insights that previous missions had been unable to gather before their systems failed. The timing and positioning suggest detailed knowledge of American tactical doctrine and pilot training procedures. Diana's approach to the intercept incorporated deception and unpredictability that made it difficult for the hijackers to implement their proven countermeasures against her aircraft. Instead of following the systematic procedures that they had successfully exploited against previous missions, she used irregular, flight patterns and manual navigation techniques that couldn't be predicted using knowledge of contemporary American military training. The psychological dimension of the tactical engagement became apparent as Diana maintained contact with the target aircraft for significantly longer than any previous mission had achieved. The hijackers' countermeasures appeared designed to create specific types of stress and confusion that would overwhelm pilots who had been trained to rely on technological systems for tactical decision-making. Diana's experience with flying under adverse conditions provided immunity to psychological tactics that had proven effective against younger pilots who had never operated without technological support. Her comfort with manual flight controls and analog navigation meant that electronic interference and system failures created inconvenience rather than the panic and disorientation that had characterized previous intercept attempts. Phoenix Leader. To Thunder Control. I'm observing patterns in target maneuvering that suggest the hijackers are attempting to implement countermeasures that target specific technological dependencies. Diana transmitted, providing tactical intelligence that could prove valuable for future operations. Their tactics appear optimized for defeating pilots who rely on automated systems for formation flying and navigation. Her continued success in maintaining contact with the target aircraft began attracting attention from Pentagon officials who had been monitoring the crisis with growing alarm as each intercept mission had ended in failure. Deputy Defense Secretary Chun contacted Diana directly using secure communication channels to understand how her obsolete aircraft was succeeding where the most advanced fighters had failed catastrophically. Colonel Vasquez, how are you maintaining mission effectiveness when our most sophisticated aircraft have been unable to sustain contact? Chun asked, her question reflecting growing recognition that institutional assumptions about technological superiority might require fundamental re-evaluation. Diana's response challenged core beliefs about military modernization that had shaped defense policy for over a decade. Madam Secretary, the hijackers have developed countermeasures that specifically target the technological systems and training procedures that characterize contemporary American military aviation, she explained while maintaining visual contact with the target. My aircraft and methods predate their countermeasures, making them less effective against approaches they weren't designed to defeat. The implications of Diana's success extended far beyond the immediate crisis because they suggested that American military capabilities might be vulnerable to adversaries who understood how to exploit technological dependencies and procedural predictability. If relatively simple countermeasures could defeat billion-dollar aircraft systems, then the entire modernization program that had shaped contemporary military aviation might require comprehensive reassessment. Diana's tactical maneuvering gradually positioned her aircraft for the kind of close-range intercept that previous missions had been unable to achieve due to early system failures and pilot disorientation. Her ability to operate effectively using manual flight controls and visual navigation provided tactical flexibility that the hijackers' countermeasures couldn't compromise because they targeted technological systems rather than fundamental pilot skills. Thunder Control. Phoenix Leader is in position to attempt communication with target aircraft. Diana reported, having achieved the mission objective that had eluded every previous intercept attempt. Requesting authorization to establish radio contact and attempt negotiation before considering alternative response options. The authorization came directly from Pentagon Command Authority, reflecting the recognition that Diana had accomplished what America's most advanced military technology had been unable to achieve. Her success demonstrated that sometimes the most effective solutions involved returning to proven methods that had been discarded in favor of sophisticated approaches that created new vulnerabilities while solving old problems. As Diana prepared to make contact with the hijackers who had systematically defeated American technological superiority through understanding rather than overwhelming capability, She reflected on the broader lessons that the crisis was teaching about the relationship between technological advancement and fundamental competence in military operations where lives depended on pilot judgment rather than computer performance. Hijacked aircraft ahead of her represented more than a single threat to national security. It had become a test case for determining whether American military institutions could acknowledge that modernization without corresponding attention to fundamental skills had created systematic vulnerabilities that could be exploited by enemies who understood American military culture and training better than American military leaders understood the limitations of their own technological dependencies. Diana's radio transmission to the hijacked aircraft marked the first successful communication attempt in over 72 hours of crisis. Boeing 777. This is United States Air Force Colonel Diana Vasquez. She announced over standard aviation frequencies, her voice carrying the authority that came from 3 decades of military service and the confidence of someone who had finally achieved what 13 previous aircraft had failed to accomplish. I am in position off your port wing for immediate visual communication. The response came after nearly 30 seconds of silence, delivered in accented English that carried undertones of professional military training. Colonel Vasquez, we have been monitoring your approach with considerable interest, the hijacker replied, his tone suggesting both surprise and grudging respect for her success in maintaining contact. You are flying differently than the others. Your aircraft is older. Your methods are traditional. Diana recognized the tactical significance of this acknowledgement because it confirmed her analysis that the hijackers had developed their countermeasures based on detailed knowledge of contemporary American military aviation doctrine. Their surprise at encountering methods that predated modern training programs revealed that their entire operational plan had been designed around exploiting predictable technological dependencies that her approach circumvented entirely. I represent the United States government in negotiations for the immediate release of 312 passengers and crew. Diana continued, maintaining professional composure while positioning her aircraft for optimal tactical advantage. State your demands and we can begin discussions for peaceful resolution of this situation. The hijackers' response revealed sophisticated understanding of American military capabilities and limitations that extended far beyond knowledge that could be acquired through external intelligence gathering. Colonel, your government has spent billions developing aircraft that can be defeated by methods available to any engineering student who understands American military training procedures, he said with evident satisfaction. We have demonstrated that technological superiority means nothing when your pilots cannot think beyond their computer screens. Diana's tactical assessment of the conversation indicated that the hijackers viewed their success as proof of fundamental flaws in American military modernization rather than simply as means to achieve political objectives. Their operation had been designed to expose and exploit institutional vulnerabilities that could affect American military operations far beyond this single incident. Your demonstration has been noted, Diana replied, using acknowledgement as a tactical tool to encourage continued communication, while gathering intelligence about the hijackers' motivations and capabilities. However, I'm here representing different approaches to military aviation that your countermeasures were not designed to defeat. The admission that her methods had neutralized their carefully planned countermeasures appeared to create uncertainty among the hijackers that hadn't been evident in their previous communications with American forces. Their tactical planning had apparently assumed that all American military pilots would respond according to contemporary training protocols, making Diana's traditional approaches an unexpected variable in their operational calculations. Diana's success in maintaining tactical contact began attracting real-time attention from the highest levels of American government, as news of her breakthrough reached officials who had been monitoring the crisis with growing alarm. President Rebecca Martinez personally contacted Diana through secure military communication channels, her voice carrying the weight of executive authority combined with desperate hope that this unexpected development might prevent national catastrophe. "Colonel Vasquez, this is President Martinez," came the transmission that marked the first direct presidential communication with an active pilot during a combat mission in over 2 decades. "The entire national security apparatus is monitoring your mission. What do you need from us to bring those passengers home safely?" Diana's response reflected tactical priorities that emphasized immediate mission requirements over political considerations. "Madam President, I need authorization to use whatever methods prove necessary to resolve this situation, including approaches that may not conform to current military protocols or international aviation regulations." The presidential authorization came without hesitation, accompanied by formal immunity from prosecution for any actions taken during the mission. "Colonel, you have complete operational authority to take whatever actions your judgment determines are necessary to protect American lives and national security." The conversation with the hijackers resumed as Diana maneuvered her aircraft into increasingly close formation with the Boeing 777, using flight techniques that demonstrated capabilities the hijackers had not anticipated from American military pilots. Her ability to fly precise formation using visual reference and manual controls rather than automated systems provided tactical advantages that their countermeasures couldn't compromise. "Colonel Vasquez, your flying demonstrates skills that we did not expect to encounter," the hijacker admitted, his voice carrying grudging professional respect for Diana's capabilities. "Most American pilots we have observed cannot maintain formation without their computers telling them where to position their aircraft." Diana used this acknowledgement to probe the extent of the hijackers' knowledge about American military training and their specific tactical objectives. "Your assessment of contemporary pilot training appears accurate," she replied. "However, not all American pilots receive the same education. Some of us learned to fly before computers made decisions for U.S. The tactical intelligence that emerged from this exchange revealed that the hijackers possessed detailed understanding of American military modernization programs, including specific knowledge about training methodologies, equipment capabilities, and procedural dependencies that had characterized contemporary pilot development. This information suggested either extensive intelligence gathering operations or direct insider knowledge of American military aviation culture. Diana's continued success in maintaining close-range contact with the hijacked aircraft began generating intense interest from military analysts who recognized that her methods were providing tactical options that had been unavailable during previous intercept attempts. Her ability to operate effectively using techniques that predated the systems the hijackers had learned to compromise created possibilities for mission resolution that contemporary approaches had been unable to achieve. Colonel Webb, monitoring the situation from Thunderbolt's Tactical Operations Center, found himself forced to acknowledge that the training methods he had opposed during Diana's final years of service were proving more effective than the modernization programs he had championed. "She's maintaining tactical contact using methods we stopped teaching 5 years ago," he admitted to the assembled staff officers, who were witnessing capabilities they had been trained to consider obsolete. The psychological impact of Diana's success extended beyond immediate tactical considerations, because it demonstrated that institutional assumptions about technological superiority might require fundamental reevaluation. Officers who had built their careers on promoting modernization found themselves confronting evidence that their approaches had created vulnerabilities that adversaries could exploit through relatively simple countermeasures. Diana's negotiation with the hijackers gradually revealed their specific demands, which included public acknowledgement of American military vulnerabilities, release of classified information about pilot training programs, and formal recognition that technological advancement without corresponding human development had created systematic weaknesses in national defense capabilities. "Colonel, our objective is not terrorism in the traditional sense," the lead hijacker explained during extended communication that provided unprecedented insight into their motivations. "We seek to demonstrate that American military power rests on foundations that are more fragile than your leaders acknowledge. Your success in reaching us proves that we have been correct about these vulnerabilities." The demands reflected sophisticated understanding of American political and military culture that suggested extensive planning and preparation by adversaries who understood how to exploit institutional blind spots for strategic advantage. Their operation had been designed to force public recognition of defense vulnerabilities that could affect American military credibility worldwide. Diana's tactical response incorporated psychological elements that challenged the hijackers' assumptions about American military culture and institutional flexibility. "Your demonstration has been successful in exposing training weaknesses," she acknowledged. "However, you've also proved that American military capabilities include adaptability that your planning didn't anticipate." The acknowledgement that her success represented institutional adaptability rather than individual exception appeared to create uncertainty among the hijackers about whether their broader strategic objectives could be achieved through continued confrontation. Their operation had been planned around assumptions of American institutional rigidity that Diana's mission was challenging through demonstrated flexibility. As negotiations continued, Diana maintained tactical positioning that provided multiple response options while gathering intelligence about the hijackers' capabilities, intentions, and psychological state. Her experience with crisis management under pressure enabled her to balance diplomatic engagement with preparation for potential military action if negotiations failed to achieve passenger safety. The breakthrough in communication had attracted international attention as news organizations reported that a single pilot using obsolete equipment had succeeded, where the most advanced military technology had failed catastrophically. The story was being framed as vindication for traditional approaches to military training and criticism of modernization programs that had eliminated fundamental skills in favor of technological dependence. Diana's success in maintaining tactical contact while conducting negotiations represented more than individual achievement. It demonstrated institutional capability to adapt when confronted with challenges that exposed weaknesses in established approaches. Her mission was becoming a case study in military flexibility that could influence defense policy and training programs for decades to come. The hijackers' growing recognition that their carefully planned operation had encountered unexpected variables began influencing their tactical calculations and negotiating positions. Diana's demonstrated capabilities had proven that American military effectiveness wasn't entirely dependent on the technological systems they had learned to defeat, creating strategic uncertainty about their ability to achieve broader objectives. Through continued confrontation. As the negotiation phase of the mission continued, Diana prepared for the possibility that diplomatic resolution might prove insufficient to ensure passenger safety, maintaining tactical readiness for alternative approaches, while working to understand the hijackers' psychological state and decision-making processes under pressure that their planning might not have adequately anticipated. The resolution came at 1834 Pacific Standard Time, when Diana executed a tactical maneuver that no hijacker had anticipated and no contemporary pilot had been trained to perform. Using techniques developed during her early career, when pilots learned to fly through intuition and experience rather than computer assistance, she positioned her F-16 in a formation that effectively boxed the Boeing 777 into a flight corridor that led directly toward a secure military airfield while making evasive action impossible without risking catastrophic collision. Boeing 777, you are now flying under escort toward McCord Air Force Base, Diana announced with the calm authority of someone who had transformed a hostage situation into a controlled landing sequence. Any deviation from current heading will result in immediate defensive action to protect civilian populations on the ground. The hijackers' response revealed the complete collapse of their tactical planning when confronted with capabilities they had not anticipated from American military aviation. Colonel Vasquez, this maneuver was not covered in our intelligence about American pilot training. He admitted with grudging recognition that his operational assumptions had been fundamentally flawed. We prepared countermeasures for technological dependence, not for individual skill. Diana's success in forcing the hijacked aircraft toward a safe landing represented more than tactical victory. It demonstrated that American military capabilities included adaptability and individual expertise that adversaries could not easily predict or counter through intelligence gathering about institutional training programs. Her mission had exposed the limitations of enemy planning that relied too heavily on assumptions about American military standardization. The safe landing at McCord Air Force Base concluded with all 312 passengers and crew members evacuated without injury, while federal agents took the hijackers into custody for interrogation that would reveal the full extent of their knowledge about American military vulnerabilities. The operation that had been designed to expose American weaknesses had instead demonstrated American strengths that existed outside the technological systems that had been systematically exploited. President Martinez personally flew to McCord Air Force Base to thank Diana for preventing what could have been the most devastating terrorist attack in American history. Their conversation in the base commander's office reflected recognition that the crisis had revealed fundamental issues with military modernization that required immediate attention from the highest levels of government. Colonel Vasquez, your success has forced us to reconsider basic assumptions about military training and technological dependence, President Martinez said during their private meeting. The Pentagon is already beginning a comprehensive review of pilot development programs based on what we've learned from this crisis. Diana's response emphasized that the lessons extended beyond military aviation to broader questions about institutional wisdom and the value of experience in technological organizations. Madam President, this incident demonstrated that modernization without maintaining fundamental capabilities creates vulnerabilities that adversaries can exploit through understanding rather than superior technology. The institutional changes that followed Diana's mission represented the most significant revision of military training doctrine since the end of the Cold War. Pentagon officials who had championed technological modernization found themselves forced to acknowledge that their programs had created systematic weaknesses that threatened national security when exploited by adversaries who understood American military culture. General Morrison, who had been instrumental in Diana's forced retirement, submitted her resignation within 48 hours of the mission's conclusion, acknowledging that her modernization programs had eliminated capabilities that proved essential for national defense. Her departure marked the beginning of leadership changes that would reshape American military aviation for the next generation. Diana's reinstatement to active duty was accompanied by promotion to Brigadier General and appointment as Director of Traditional Skills Integration, a newly created position that reflected institutional recognition of the value of experience-based training alongside technological education. Her mandate included developing comprehensive programs that would ensure future pilots maintained fundamental capabilities while mastering modern systems. The new training programs that emerged from Diana's recommendations incorporated both contemporary technology and traditional skills that had been systematically eliminated during the modernization era. Pilots would learn to navigate by compass and celestial reference, to fly formation using visual cues rather than automated systems, and to make tactical decisions based on experience and judgment rather than algorithmic guidance. Captain Foster, whose squadron had been lost during the crisis, became one of the most vocal advocates for the integrated training approach after experiencing limitations of purely technological education under pressure. His testimony before congressional hearings investigating the incident provided powerful evidence that contemporary pilot development had created dangerous gaps in fundamental capabilities. The hijackers defeated us not through superior technology, but through understanding our weaknesses better than we understood them ourselves. Foster testified during nationally televised hearings that examined military preparedness and training effectiveness. General Vasquez succeeded because she possessed capabilities that our modernization programs had eliminated in favor of technological dependence. The congressional investigation revealed that similar vulnerabilities existed throughout American military services, where specialization and technological focus had gradually eliminated comprehensive training that developed adaptable professionals, capable of operating effectively when primary systems failed. Diana's mission had exposed institutional problems that affected national security far beyond aviation. Military academies across the country began implementing curriculum changes that incorporated traditional skills alongside contemporary technology, recognizing that comprehensive education produced more capable officers than specialized training that assumed technological systems would always function according to design parameters. Diana's influence extended to fundamental questions about how military professionals should be prepared for uncertain futures. International allies began requesting access to Diana's training methodologies after recognizing that their own military modernization programs had created similar vulnerabilities to those exploited during the hijacking crisis. Her approaches influenced military education worldwide as nations acknowledged that technological advancement without corresponding human development created systematic weaknesses that adversaries could exploit. The hijackers, during extensive interrogation, revealed that their operation had been planned specifically to expose American military vulnerabilities that could be exploited in future conflicts. Their intelligence had identified institutional dependencies that made American forces predictable and vulnerable to countermeasures that targeted technological systems rather than overwhelming them through superior capability. Diana's success had invalidated years of enemy intelligence gathering and tactical planning based on assumptions about American military standardization. Her demonstration that American capabilities included adaptability and individual expertise that couldn't be easily predicted or countered forced adversaries to reconsider their strategies for confronting American military power. The broader implications of Diana's mission extended to civilian organizations that had embraced technological solutions while eliminating fundamental skills and institutional knowledge. Corporate leaders began recognizing that overdependence on technological systems could create vulnerabilities similar to those that had affected military aviation, leading to renewed interest in comprehensive employee development and institutional memory preservation. Diana's story became required reading at military academies and business schools as an example of how experience and traditional knowledge remain valuable in technological environments. Her mission demonstrated that progress required balance between innovation and wisdom, between technological capability and human judgment, developed through years of experience under challenging conditions. The memorial service for the pilots lost during the hijacking crisis honored their sacrifice while acknowledging that their deaths had revealed institutional problems that threatened national security. Diana's remarks at the service emphasized that the best way to honor their memory was to ensure that future pilots received comprehensive training that would prevent similar tragedies. As Diana established her new training programs at bases across the country, she reflected on the irony that her forced retirement had led to recall for a mission that validated everything she had been trying to teach about the relationship between technology and human capability. The crisis had demonstrated that sometimes the oldest approaches provided the most reliable solutions when newer methods failed under pressure. The transformation of American military aviation that followed Diana's mission represented institutional learning from the crisis that strengthened national defense. capabilities while honoring both technological advancement and traditional expertise. Her influence ensured that future generations of pilots would possess comprehensive skills that could adapt to any challenge, whether technological or traditional, that threatened American security interests. The woman who had been dismissed as too old to serve had become the architect of military training reform that would influence American defense capabilities for decades to come, proving that experience and wisdom remained essential components of national security, regardless of technological advancement or institutional fashion. 5 years later, Diana stood before a new class of pilot trainees at the newly renamed Vasquez Institute for Comprehensive Aviation Training. The facility buzzed with activity as young aviators practiced both cutting-edge digital systems and time-tested manual navigation techniques side by side. "Ma'am," asked Lieutenant Sarah Chun, one of her brightest students, "do you ever regret not staying retired in that peaceful cabin?" Diana smiled, watching through the window as pilots seamlessly transitioned between high-tech simulators and vintage aircraft that taught fundamental flying skills. "Sarah, that hijacking taught us something crucial about the future. It's not about choosing between old and new. It's about understanding that true expertise means being prepared for anything." The Institute had become a model for military training worldwide, producing pilots who could adapt to any situation, whether their computers worked perfectly or failed completely. Diana's integrated approach had eliminated the vulnerabilities that enemies had once exploited, creating a new generation of aviators who combined technological mastery with timeless skills. Her phone buzzed with a message from President Martinez, another international delegation requesting your training protocols. "Your influence continues to strengthen global aviation security." Diana pocketed the device and returned her attention to the students who represented the future of military aviation. The crisis that had nearly ended her career had instead launched a revolution in how societies balanced innovation with wisdom, proving that sometimes being called too old simply meant you were thinking further ahead than everyone else. What seemingly outdated skill or traditional knowledge in your life might actually be preparing you for challenges others can't see coming. Share your thoughts in the comments below. We love hearing your stories of when experience trumped technology. Don't forget to subscribe for more incredible stories about everyday heroes who prove that wisdom and preparation never go out of style. And hit that notification bell so you never miss our latest uploads.